Hi, my name is James Linkenheld. I'm a seminarian for the Diocese of Rockford and assigned here at St. Thomas Parish for the summer. And I'd like to welcome you to the Christ et al. Series. Perhaps a word about this series before we get started. Christ et al. We find in bibliographies and citations, signifying a list. The first one's named, and then there's another list, and it's one among many. And that'll be the theme for these next four talk series. Is Jesus Christ one among many? And so for this, we'll look at that through the four relevant time periods of church history. This first talk, Christ in the Ancient World. I came up with this topic after reflecting on an episode back when I was in college, hanging out with some buddies. We were talking about Christianity. And one of my classmates speaks up and says that Jesus is, for his time, a good teacher. He spoke some good truths that for his time, we're all right. And so we can take that. And so that's the question that I'd like to challenge. This talk will be a challenge or a response to that notion. Is Jesus just one religious teacher or thinker among many in the ancient world? Let's look at that in two spheres of influence in the ancient world. By ancient world, I mean the time leading up to the Christ event. So first of all, we'll do philosophy and then theology, or religion. Let's first of all theology, or philosophy, excuse me. Two major schools come out of the 5th, 4th, and 3rd centuries, that of Plato and Aristotle. So first, Plato kind of synthesizes the philosophies that come before him, and his whole school idea of there's two worlds, that of the world of forms, as he calls it, and then the created world. World of forms, it's kind of an abstract thing, because it's an immaterial thing. You can't touch justice. You can't hold beauty, the idea of beauty in your hands. It's an immaterial thing. So Plato says those things are real and they exist in this world of forms. Think of your coffee cup. It's got a round lid to it, or base. The idea of round doesn't exist in the coffee cup. It exists in the world of forms. And the coffee cup is round insofar as it participates in this heavenly realm, this ethereal world. So that's kind of what we're dealing with here, world of forms. And they're perfect, they're unchanging, they're good in themselves. So you think of goodness, which would be the highest form, Plato says, or beauty. These are things we can't touch. Fine. So Plato posits that there's this creative cosmic artist that, upon gazing on this world of forms, creates the material world that you and I exist in, that which is changing and uncertain, coming to be and passing out of existence. We're kind of reflections or participations in the world of forms. We exist only insofar as we have a sort of form about us. So that's a lot of lofty language and ideas. But the point is this, that Plato posits that there's a divine and a created order, and that there's a contact between the two. That's Plato. Aristotle, on the other hand, succeeds Plato, and he comes to the idea of one supreme being. Through a series of arguments, he comes to his famous unmoved mover, or first cause. This is being in itself, existence in itself. Its very nature is to be. This is Aristotle's basis for all of his philosophy, because everything that exists now around us that you and I see is coming to be in degrees. And in fact, that degree idea is his counter to Plato's participation. You think of a rock. A rock is more perfect than something that doesn't exist at all. And yet the flower is more perfect to the rock still, because it exists in a higher plane, closer to being in itself. It has more being about it, the rose does, compared to the flower. It grows. Now the squirrel is in fact more perfect than the flower, than the rose, because now it can move itself, and it's got the instincts, and it perceives and has sense. Sense has contact with what's around it. And then finally, you and I, we reason, we think, and Plato or Aristotle uses that to ultimately prove the immortality of our souls. And so we are more perfect still because we have a higher degree of likeness to the supreme unmoved mover, to being in itself. So that's the point with Aristotle. With Plato, there's the divine and the created order, and there is contact between it. Aristotle comes to that within the divine order, there's just the one that we're moving back towards in creation, degrees of creation. That was a lot. That's philosophy. You can kind of close that off. Now, the next sphere is religion. I was thinking about how to approach this, and the pagan religions just are kind of lackluster to me. They don't really say much about God because their gods, plural, small g, they're really just super people, and bad people at that. You think of Zeus coming down and having relations with everyone around him, taking for himself. You think of Marvel, and you've got an idea of what an ancient god was like. Thor, for example. He's a Norse god, but he's really just a Superman. And so we're not going to talk about that. What's interesting to me is what's going on in Israel at the time. They're so different with their monotheism, one God. They believe in one. And so let's start with the Babylonian exile. Now, don't worry, we're not going to go through the whole Babylonian exile. But out of that comes the concept of Judaism that would be around in the Christ times. So what's happening there? Well, from 597 to 539, about 60 years, the Israelite people are deported. They're in exile. They're out of their territory. They're in Babylon. Babylon comes and destroys the temple and deports thousands back to their city. So the Jews are taking this time, their kind of worldview and their view of themselves, their view of God is fractured. It's shaken up. They were supposed to be the chosen people. They were supposed to be the favored ones, and now they're not even living in the promised land. And so they kind of lose, what's their sense of identity? The temple was everything for them, their worship, their place in the law and the precepts. And so in exile, to claim that national identity, to keep their distinctiveness from the pagans around them, they clung to those rituals that were not necessary for the temple to be around for. I'm thinking of the Sabbath, circumcision, dietary laws, fasting. These were things that became super important to the Jewish faith at this time because it was their sense of national identity. And even after exile, these things remained important because they were subsequently ruled over by the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. When they first came back, the Edomites, their neighbors to the south, had pillaged and plundered that which was left that the Babylonians had left. There really kind of nothing going on. At the same time this is happening, the prophets are having an interesting discussion. All the prophetic books, extending back to Amos, the prophet in the 8th century. First half of the book, condemnation, devastation for the people, destruction, obviously foretelling eventually the exile. But it's interesting, the last half of the book, most of the prophetic books, end with these hymns, these strange paradoxical oracles of salvation, these hymns and promises of God for his intervention. Well, after the exile, they're, like I mentioned, ruled over by many foreign nations. And so they're wondering, what's going on here? We have this prophetic paradox of oracles and hymns of salvation, and yet we're ruled over by those that God has not chosen. We're the chosen ones. And so this sort of skepticism arises. The skepticism about, is God going to fulfill these promises, and when, how? Sometime soon, or is he just forgotten about us? Does he not care anymore? Have we sinned and... So skepticism meets with these new strict observance of the letter of the law that I mentioned, following what we see in Leviticus or Deuteronomy, the Sabbath, the circumcision, the dietary laws. That was held to as a strict national identity creating thing. And so when this strict holding on to the law, that kind of closes them to any new interpretation of it, which is what the prophets were doing. That meets with this skepticism to create Christianism that moves to the political realm. They're closed off to anything new because what they hold on to is the old. That's what gives them their identity. And the skepticism about the Messiah coming, the promised one coming, meets that. And so the Messiah, the promised, can't be fulfilled in anything new. And so they think they're waiting for this them from their political bondage in order to practice what was given them of old more freely. Right? It's a very strange time for the Jews. I think of Ezekiel, where God is the good shepherd, or his vision of at the end of his book of the return of the glory of the Lord to a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. Well, he's writing in Babylon. He's writing in the exile. Or you think of the middle section of Isaiah, great themes of a new exodus. They're wonderful themes of leaving a place of bondage in Babylon and journeying through the foreign lands to come to Jerusalem, or the promised land, the return to Jerusalem. Well, he's writing in Babylon. This section takes form in the exile. So this is a paradox going on. A lot going on in Judaism there. So from that is what we see Judaism now, or then. So that's a lot of legwork already. What's the context of the ancient world? Well, in a word, I would say it's one of expectation. Expectation. The philosophers, with their divine order and the created order, the one, they're waiting sort of for a figure to come and expound on that truth, to give them the truth. That's the philosopher's quest. The truth of the divine and created orders. And it might not be spelled out, but that's within their heart, prompts their search. This interlocutor between the divine and the created. And in Judaism, obviously, they're waiting for this political Messiah, expecting the promise to be fulfilled, but nothing new, something to free them to practice the old. This is the context, one of expectation. And so what comes? What comes? Well, St. John tells us perfectly in his wonderful prologue to the gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He says in his letter, first letter, what we have seen and touched and heard. He's referring to God. God came. God himself came. Now let's not disparage this or depreciate this by calling it a cliche. Yes, God came. Yeah, we know that. That's why I'm listening to this talk. No, think about what that meant in the ancient worldview. Because who is God? What have we just reviewed? God is the supreme being. God is the one perfect in himself, the very act of existence. God is so transcendent above the created order. He's the first cause, the unmoved mover, which means perfect in himself, he can move other things at his will, right? He's the one from which you and I take our existence, and we only exist insofar as we're connected in some way to the one, the supreme. This is the God who sent the Israelites to their knees in terror at the base of Mount Sinai when he comes down in the great spectacle that is the giving of the law. The Israelites, they're so terrified by what they see. They say, let him not speak to us. They send Moses up. Moses, you speak to him and tell us what he said. But let him not speak to us, lest we die. This is the God who is clearing out foreign nations in front of Israel during the Exodus. This is the God who is governing time and ordering history from his place transcending above history. This worldview of God, completely other. The Israelites were afraid to pronounce his name, so they called him Adonai, Lord, rather than what he gave to Moses, because they were so afraid of him. This is the God who came. It was not enough for God to remain above and touch creation, or send a messenger to tell us about himself. No, it was not enough for him to pronounce forgiveness to you and I from his place above. No, the divine uncreated nature comes and assumes to himself a life of creature. Think about that which is infinite becomes something we can touch and see and hear. And it's for you and I that he does this. This is how the promises and expectations are fulfilled. That God would come to meet you and I from the very life we have, a finite one. This is the person of Jesus Christ. This is the newness that Christ brings to the world. You see, he brings this because he supersedes and utterly shatters the expectation that the philosophers and the religion of the time had. Think of what's going on in the philosophers. The man who can expound on and treat on the order of creation, or the nature of the divine and the nature of the creation, this is the man who rules. In fact, Plato would crown him king of a nation. But he would gather pupils to himself and found a school in order to pass on his wisdom. Now, I'm not making out Christ to be some philosopher king. That's not his mission. That's not why he came. But the philosopher comes to expound on creation and divinity. Christ gathers a group amongst himself, and he sits down and he teaches. What does he teach but about himself? He's teaching himself. The great Vatican II documents, De Verbum and Gaudium et Spes, they say that Jesus reveals God to man through his words and deeds, in De Verbum, words and deeds. Basically, what flows from his person. In the very person of Jesus, we have a treatise on divine life. Remember, we only know about the Trinity because of the person. Jesus came, the great inner secret of Trinitarian life is revealed to man. But also, Gaudium et Spes points out in paragraph 22 that Jesus reveals man to himself. And man being the highest of the material world, including all of that which is beneath him, Jesus reveals creation to itself, right? It's not just Jesus, God, explaining things. He assumed a human nature. The divine word, the Son, took to himself a perfectly human nature. And so we can look at Jesus and say, what the answer to the question, what does it mean to be perfectly man? To be perfectly human is to look like Jesus. And so he's treating on himself. We find the most perfect explanation of the divine and creative orders in the person of Jesus Christ. And so the philosopher is waiting for his interlocutor, this kind of keen intellect that's eager to observe and explain that which is around him. That expectation is completely superseded because God comes to explain the divine and the creation. God himself, the supreme being, comes to explain. Fine. Philosophers, check. Now on the religious side, just look at what we see in the Gospels, Christ's life. Jesus comes to claim authority claims the authority to reinterpret the law in terms of himself. He's taking Moses and with the authority of the one that talked to Moses, explaining things. This is the Sermon on the Mount, and this is what riles up the scribes and Pharisees throughout the whole gospel, that great polemics that we see. This is what it means when he says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." Think of the teaching on adultery or teaching on marriage. Or the Sabbath. Remember that great institution of the Sabbath that gave identity, national identity to the Israelites. Well, Christ comes and turns it around into his own person. They're walking through the fields and his disciples are picking grain. The scribes and Pharisees question him, "How could you allow this to happen? They should be resting on the Sabbath." And the great teaching of Jesus is this, that the Sabbath was made for man, not and the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is where the rest of God comes. The nation would rest and pray and be with God. Well, if Jesus is saying that now he is the rest Israel has waited for, that now in his person, we will find rest, the rest of God. That's the stuff of revolutions. This is around. It's utterly restructuring anything that the Judaism had tried to find in itself. And so this is Jesus' life and mission. We see this throughout his whole polemic against the scribes and Pharisees. And so what do? Well, rather than, they're faced with a choice. Utterly change everything about themselves, starting with their hearts. They could get rid of Jesus. And that's what they do. They conspire amongst themselves and involve the political authorities of the time and put him to death to try to get rid of this troublemaker, the one who would take away their nation as they knew it. We know this isn't the end, of course. He rises. But what does he do the first thing after he rises? I'm thinking of Easter Sunday night on the road to Emmaus. He meets the two disciples. And what does he do? He expounds on the scriptures. The law and the prophets have been fulfilled in what has taken place in Jerusalem. He tells them, did you not know that this had to be? That in his life, death, and resurrection, in his person, Moses and the prophets are fulfilled. Jesus Christ is the apex of divine revelation. All that God has done and been at work in Israel finds its fulfillment in apex, the person of Jesus Christ. Obviously, superseding the political Messiah of old that they had yearned for, still longing for, the one who would free them to practice what they held to. We see that Jesus coming in the person of the Son, the person of Jesus who is God, brings a newness that shatters the old expectation. So let's wrap this up. Philosophers, expectation shattered. Religion, Judaism, expectation shattered. And so what's the lesson here? All of that, we're finally getting to the lesson. But bear with me. The lesson here is that we can't tame Christ by relegating him to his context. If we were to ask the question, one religious thinker or leader among many in the ancient world, we've seen that the answer is a resounding and wholehearted no, not by a long shot, not any chance. What he is, who he is, has confounded the brightest minds for 2,000 years. And I'm not saying that we have to, in order to know Jesus, that we divorce him from his historical context. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, what we've done is show that we can only understand the whole of Jesus by looking at what was the context he came into. Now, what I'm saying is that you can't say that he was a nice teacher. You can't say that he was just some young Jewish man walking the hills of Galilee, going on and on like any other would, and that his kind of pedestrian or nice teachings the rabbis didn't like and they put him to death. You can't say that at all, looking at what we've looked at. No, who Jesus was so radically singular, was so unlike and out of the ordinary, extraordinary than what anyone had seen before, that religious leaders and political leaders put him to death for it, for who he was. What I'm saying is that the philosophers kicked Paul out of Athens when he tried to talk about Jesus Christ and the resurrection. They talk about this later, but get out of here. What I'm saying is that Jesus Christ is so radically new that he changes reality in the ancient world. And so these are good things that we've gone through. It's good for us to consider this, and it's worthy of pondering themselves. But I'll give you two practical applications of all this. The second following on the first. The first being, if we can appreciate the newness that Christ brought to the ancient world, the radicalness of who he is, then we allow ourselves to be open to the workings of God's grace. We open ourselves up, if we can appreciate the newness of Christ, we open ourselves up to the love of God. Because, friends, this is what's behind the whole operation. Because God loves you and me, Jesus Christ came. Because God loves you and me, God came and revealed himself to us completely, who he is completely in the Trinity. Because you are singularly, radically loved, Jesus Christ turned the ancient world on its head. So if we can appreciate that, we open ourselves up to a deeper knowledge of the love God has for each one of us. And so to follow on that, the second practical application is that by pondering the newness of Christ, if Christ is a singular radical event and he's a person, then that bears a singular radical relationship with him. Our relationship with Christ isn't like one among many that we would have with anyone else, because he's a different person than anything the world has seen. Then we need to have a most total relationship with him, a radical holding to him, radical clinging to him. And so here's my recommendation. Take a few things that stuck out to you. A lot of content was just given to you in the last 20, 30 minutes. Take some things that stuck out to you, maybe rewatch it, or share it with friends and talk about it. And take those things that stick out to prayer before the Blessed Sacrament, which is the real presence of Jesus. Take it to adoration or prayer and think about, get to know the person of Jesus. He's alive, and he continues to bring that newness to each one of us in the Holy Spirit from the right hand of the Father, his place in heaven. He's at work organizing and commanding the angels to help us on our way. Pray about the person of Jesus. Get to know him. And fall deeper in love with him, because that's who he reveals himself to be. That's the newness that the philosophers couldn't get to. The newness that the Judaism had kind of closed itself off to in a sense. That God is love. And that love meets you and I in the person of Jesus. Let's take that to prayer. Our next video will be talking about the early church and how it struggled to understand the person of Jesus. The many failed attempts that we call heresies to try to understand him. Know of my prayers for you in the coming weeks, and please keep me in your prayers. And together, hopefully, we come a little bit farther along the path to the life of God, the path